Good morning. If you have your Bibles, please open them with me to the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, verses 10 through 14. It's Isaiah chapter 7, verses 10 through 14. We'll be concentrating primarily on the 14th verse. Most of the time, Isaiah 7:14 is only brought up about once a year, and that's at Christmas time. That's pretty unfortunate because really this passage is central to the faith of the Christian, even though it is something that was written and prophesied about 700 and some odd years before Jesus was even born. There's a lot of different things going on in this prophecy that we don't have time to get into and that we probably really don't even understand, but we do understand the thrust of it. This is several hundred years, like I said, about 700 and some odd years before Jesus is born. Israel is being reigned by one of the worst kings, not the worst, but one of the worst kings that they had ever had in their history, King Ahaz. And yet, there still seems to be some form of faith that Ahaz retains in God, at least remedial. And so, in verse 10 of Isaiah 7, it says, "Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." And he said, "Hear then, O house of David. Is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel." All right, and so like I said, there's a lot of things here that we probably don't fully grasp. People will oftentimes ask the question, well, if this is a prophecy about Jesus, then why is Jesus not named Immanuel? That's what it says here in Isaiah chapter 7. Not all translations, from what I gather, actually use the name Immanuel, but rather the definition of Immanuel. And the definition of Immanuel is simply God with us. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. In fact, for the foreseeable future, I don't know how long it'll last, Lord willing, we're going to take a very in-depth look at Jesus and what all of these things mean. We are the church of Christ, for one thing. Jesus is our elder brother, our king, and we want to be those who know as much about him as we possibly can. And so this is, I believe, a good place to start at this prophecy, that Jesus is Immanuel, God with us. So why is Jesus not known as Immanuel? And as I mentioned a moment ago, not all translations put Immanuel there, but rather the definition. Jesus' name means, as we will read about in Matthew, when Gabriel, or Luke, when Gabriel tells Mary to name him Jesus, he says, name him Jesus because he will forgive his people of their sins. And so we have a connection there of the name Jesus and the forgiveness of sins. Now, here is how it all works together. This morning we talked about Genesis chapter 3 in our Bible class. And we've been going through the narrative of creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And now we've made it up to 3. And of course 3 is where we have the fall of man. Now as you're reading Genesis chapter 3, we are in the Garden of Eden. And we've already learned in chapter 2 that when God created the Garden of Eden, He made all of the trees, and He made the tree of life, which is apparently what they ate of so that they could live forever and not die. That shows us that God has always made eternal life a gift. That it was something that God had given. It wasn't something that was just inherent with our creation. The second tree, of course, is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they were not allowed to eat of that. Now, some may say that that's a dirty trick. That God would put something in the Garden of Eden that they would be tempted to eat. The thing is, there was no other choice in the Garden of Eden. And for there to be love and obedience, there has to be choice. And God has created us as free moral agents. The fact that we have the ability to choose. And so there had to be a choice whether they would choose God or whether they would choose another path. And so in Genesis 3, we see that the serpent comes to Eve. Adam is there with her. We read in that chapter as well. But the serpent tempts Eve. And they both eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we begin to see that everything that was good, and in fact, when you turn to Genesis 1, after each day of creation, it will say the morning and the evening, the first day or the second day. And before it says that God saw what it was that He created on that specific day, and He saw that it was good. At the end of the creation week, it says that God saw that it was very good. But now Adam and Eve have sinned. And so when sin means to trespass God's law or to break God's law, lawlessness, as John tells us in the book of 1 John, sin is lawlessness. It's missing the mark. God said don't do it, they did it. That's a sin of commission. Another type of sin would be a sin of omission, when God says to do something and we neglect to do it. But here we see a sin of commission. They were committing this act against God's law, against what He said not to do. And so sin has this effect that brings separation. The serpent said, well, when you do this, you're going to become like God. You're going to know the difference between good and evil. The thing is, they already knew the difference between good and evil. They weren't unintelligent. They wanted more than what God had given. At least Eve did. And then perhaps Adam just followed his wife without trying to help her. And when he was seeing all of this happen, I don't know how it all worked. But when they did this, we see vandalism to God's good creation. Because now, as you read Genesis 3, and God is walking in the garden in the cool of the day. They've hidden themselves because they've realized they're naked, so they go and they hide themselves. There's only a couple of good reasons to hide yourself. Number one, my favorite reason, is because you're playing hide and seek with your children. That's fun. Number two, you hide yourself because you're afraid of something. And we see animals hiding themselves from their predators all the time. When somebody has someone who is threatening them, or someone breaks into their house and their lives are being threatened, what do? They go hide. Hopefully they don't have to do anything more than that. But you may hide and then you prepare to fight. That's something a lot of people do. They are afraid of God. And so God is walking in the garden in the cool of the day. The implication is this is something that He does with them on a regular basis. But now sin has entered in and has vandalized their relationship with God. It was good. They were able to speak with Him. They were able to walk with Him because they were free of sin. But now they can't. And number two, not only was the relationship with God vandalized, but their relationship with one another is now vandalized also. Because at once they were united, they were together. There was nothing that was driving them apart. There was no wedge at all. But now sin has come in between them, has driven a wedge between them. God asks Adam, what have you done? And Adam says, God, it was this wife that you gave to be with me. So he blames God, he blames Eve. Then God turns to Eve and talks to her about these things. She said, well, it was the serpent. He deceived me and I ate. She's telling the truth. That's exactly what happened. Some people have said that she's throwing the serpent under the bus. She's just telling it like it was. But then as you go through and you see how God is dishing out the punitive measures, He turns to Adam and He says to him, because you've done this thing, you're going to have a lot of problems. You're going to be cast out of the garden. Now, instead of, he still had to work the garden. There was still work. It wasn't just that he was being a lazy bum and fruit was falling out of trees onto his lap. He had to work at it. Genesis 2 tells us that. But now you're going to have weeds. You're going to have thorns. You're going to have thistles. And the hard work you put in, you may not get any return. That's the consequence of what you've done. You're going to have pain. You're going to work hard all the days of your life just to get some bread, and then you're going to die. That's what you've done, Adam. Now Eve, he says, now you're going to have more pain in childbearing. Doesn't mean she wasn't going to have babies before. Now there's going to be pain involved in it. And then he says, and your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. That's not a sexual desire thing going on here. That's talking about what we refer to as the battle of the sexes. Now there's going to be that tension. We still see it today. There is a tension between male and female when God is not in the picture. It's not going to be good. And in fact, it hasn't been. And so we have a vandalism of our relationship with God. It's gone. God in the garden. God was with us. We were together, united, but now there's a wedge driven between us. So you have that vandalized. Then as we see in nature, within our own bodies and with our work, that's been vandalized as well. And not only this, verse 21, we see an animal was killed so that they would be clothed. All of that happened because of sin. God was with us, but now God is separated from us. And so the rest of the Bible, from Genesis chapter 3, very quickly in Genesis chapter 4, we begin to see the results of man's poor decision making. We see that route that we have taken and we continue to take today. You have that motif, and then you also have the rest of it at the same time. We see God enacting certain things to bring us back together with Him and with all of creation, which Paul will talk about in Romans chapter 8, when all of creation is longing for the revealing of the sons and the daughters of God. But as we continue reading, we will see that in Exodus, God has Moses build the tabernacle, as the Israelites build the tabernacle. And in the tabernacle, of course, we've talked about this before. You have the courtyard, and then you have the holy place, which is inside the tabernacle. And tabernacle is just a fancy word for tent. And you have the holy place. And inside the holy place, you have different furnishings and different things that would be included in the rituals of the people of Israel's religious rites and rituals. And then you would have the most holy place, which was divided by a very thick curtain that was decorated by cherubim. Now, don't miss the fact that when they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, what was separating them from the garden? Cherubim. And so there is cherubim on the curtain in a symbolic way of saying you can't get through. The only person that can get through is once a year, and that's the high priest, after he has made sacrifices for himself to cleanse himself of his sin. And then he goes into the most holy place on the Day of Atonement and atones for the people's sins with the blood of a lamb on the Ark of the Covenant, known as the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, known as the mercy seat. But at that Ark of the Covenant, and we remember through the wilderness wanderings, God is leading the people during the day by a pillar of cloud, and at night by a pillar of fire. During the tabernacle days, God's presence was seen there. God was with His people. But now we have a new Exodus. God is calling us and continues to call people out of the world. The invitation has gone out from Christ through the apostles, and we continue to preach and proclaim that decree. God is saying, come out of her, talking about the world, my people. He wants us to come and be with Him. And if you turn over to John chapter 1, it all comes together pretty nicely. In John chapter 1, we won't start in verse 1. We all know 1:1 very well, talking about God being the Word, or Jesus being the Word. And of course, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In verse 2, he says, He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now we're going to skip down a few verses because it talks about John the Baptist in verses 6 down through 8, proving that John was not the one that they were supposed to be looking for, but rather it was Jesus. So he picks it back up in verse 9. He says, the true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through Him, and yet the world did not know Him. He came to His own, and His own people did not receive Him. But to all who did receive Him, who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of the blood or of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Now verse 14, he says, and the Word became flesh, and some translations that you may be reading right now says, and tabernacled among us. My English Standard Version just simply says, dwelt among us. That means the same thing, but the word tabernacle there is telling, because we just talked about the tabernacle. This isn't something that people just said. You know, you don't go around saying, why don't you come over here and tabernacle with me? Jewish people never said that, as far as I know. This was a way of the author of John to say, don't miss what's going on here. Okay, God had the tabernacle built so His presence could be among His people in that cloud and in that fire. Now the Word has become flesh and He's tabernacling among us. In other words, He's here. And He's here in a way that He was not before. It's completely different than it was. It's getting down to it. Everything that the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, it's taking place in Jesus. He has come to dwell among us, God with us. That's exactly what Isaiah is referring to in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, when he says, "And He shall be called Immanuel, God with us." John says that He came and He tabernacled among us. He dwelt with us, God with us. This was the longing of people throughout the Scriptures. In Psalm chapter 27 and verse 4, let's go back to that passage. Psalm 27 and verse 4. We'll read a couple of passages from the Psalms. Here he says in this passage, "One thing that I have asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire at His temple." Of course, this was written probably about 1,000 years before Jesus. And so David he doesn't really understand everything that is going on here. The psalmist doesn't understand. I believe it's of David that this one is. Doesn't understand everything that's going to happen. He knows something's going to happen. But he wants to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So in his mind, he's thinking of the tabernacle. Because the temple hasn't been built yet. It wouldn't be built until his own son takes over after David's death. And he's probably even looking forward to something beyond the tabernacle, because I want to live in the house of the Lord forever. I want to be with Him in His presence. Notice what he says in Psalm 84 this time. Again, that's Psalm 84 in verse 10. He says in this passage, "For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere." One day in the presence of God is what this verse is meaning. One day in the presence of God is better than 1,000 days anywhere else. Now, he continues to go on in this passage. He says, "I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of the wicked." I would rather be a doorkeeper, a lowly servant in the house of God, than to dwell with wicked folks. That's really the attitude that we need to take. We sing about, "I've got a mansion over a hilltop," and the Bible tells us that we do. And that's amazing. You know what? It would be better to walk through the streets of a miserable third world country knowing that we are walking with God than to live in a posh mansion over the hilltop thinking that He's not here. Wherever we are with God is better than anywhere when we've decided to depart ourselves from Him. Then there are other passages like Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 10, wherein God tells Isaiah, and He tells Jeremiah, and He tells the other prophets, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you." Don't be afraid, for I am with you. This goes along with what John says, perfect love casts out all fear. God is perfect love. And when He is with us, there is nothing to be afraid of. When we are in His presence. And so when we look at this Immanuel, God with us, it goes all the way back to Genesis chapters 1 through 3. And it looks forward to the time of the coming of Jesus and the establishment of the church. Because He is with us right now in a way that He has not been in any other time in history. We talked about God tabernacling among His people. People had to come to God by way of sacrifice. And even then, only the high priest could get that close. It's not like that now. Oh, people may long for the days where they can look up on the hill, when they can look up at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, and they can see the presence of God at nighttime, a fire, or daytime, a cloud, and know that He's there. It's not like that anymore. It's better. Because now, God is within His people. There is no tabernacle. There's no tent anymore. There's no temple anymore except for us. The Bible says that we are the temple of God. Each one of us is a living stone. And so when we come to the idea and knowing that we are the temple of God, and that tells us that God is dwelling in us. That's what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians. He uses the term temple in two different ways. He talks about it as the church is the temple of God. What's that mean? That God is here. He talks about our bodies being a temple of the Holy Spirit. What's that mean? That God is here. God is with us. Immanuel. And not only does this look forward, when you think about Matthew 28:18 through 20, Jesus says to us, as God had told the prophets, He says, "Lo, I am with you always, even